On behalf of the Foundation of Laguna Woods Village, I'm pleased to welcome you to this broadcast, which is part of the Foundation's series called Planning for the Inevitable. This initiative focuses on decisions we should make before it's too late, but for many reasons we avoid. This is the 7th broadcast in the series, and will look at the importance of planning for the end of life. Links to the previous broadcasts are available on the Foundation's website. Many of you are familiar with the Foundation, which is our village charity, which steps in and provides temporary financial assistance to residents when they encounter financial hardship. Our motto is Neighbors Helping Neighbors. Over the years, we have expanded our help to foster quality of life in the village. For example, we are providing fall prevention workshops with memorial care and renting emergency response devices for residents who are at risk of falling. I am Deborah David. I'm a member of the Foundation board. The issue of making our own final plans was something my husband and I avoided until the Foundation began this initiative. We've had estate plans for more than a quarter century, but we hadn't taken this important step. And I don't know why, we just delayed. When my mother died a number of years ago, she had arranged and paid for her own final plans, so it was very easy for us. I mainly had to contact the mortuary and also let the family members know about the funeral logistics. But other than that, it was smooth. And with us today is Renee Tepper, pre-planning advisor for several local funeral homes and cemeteries that are affiliated with Dignity Memorial, a national company. She works with Harbor Lawn, Mount Olive, Pacific View, Fairhaven, and Westminster Memorial Parks and Mortuaries. Thank you, Renee, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me to talk about this important topic.
Okay, so let's begin. What are the benefits of pre-planning?
Deborah, there's really two main categories of benefits, if you will. There's first the emotional benefit of pre-planning. So making decisions together. Usually we've gone through life with our partner, as you mentioned, and we've maybe already done a trust and planned for many other things in our life. It makes sense to plan this together while we're both able to think clearly, we're not under a time or health constraint, and we can make choices that are meaningful to us, right? It also gives us and our loved ones peace of mind when the time would come, because none of us know what the end is going to look like. And so knowing ahead of time where we've chosen to maybe be laid to rest, or what type of memorial service or celebration we've chosen, is within our control and can give us a lot of peace of mind, as well as our loved ones who might have to carry out these plans, much like you did for your mother. So knowing that you followed that loved one's wishes and weren't guessing at what they might want. So that's the emotional side. But there's also the financial side, because when we have not made these arrangements in advance, when services are going to be rendered, everything has to be paid for all at once. When we make these arrangements in advance, we can make payment plans. We can also take advantage of today's pricing for hopefully something that will not happen for many, many years, and have some pre-need discounts, and again, that ability to pay over time. So definitely both an emotional benefit as well as a financial benefit to pre-planning.
I read in a 2021 survey by the National Funeral Directors Association that only about 36%, just over 1 in 3 people of Americans have talked with their loved ones or written plans about what they want. Why do you think so many people avoid this decision?
Oh gosh, I think there's a few reasons. I think one is, number one, that denial. It's not a comfortable conversation to have. And even if we try to have that sometimes with our loved ones, whether it be a spouse or whether it be family members, children, they don't necessarily want to hear that. They don't want to think of us passing. So we're having difficulty talking about our own passing, but also those around us don't necessarily want to engage in that conversation. So I think a little bit of that is knowing who to talk to and how to have that conversation. Seek out an expert so that you can understand what would be meaningful to you and why there is that benefit of pre-planning, so that your loved ones who think they want to make these arrangements but don't realize the difficulty of grief and mourning and trying to make those arrangements in maybe the last hours before passing or just after passing. So very difficult time. I think there's also, of course, a little bit of, if I make these arrangements, then I'm going to have that happen. And that can be a difficult conversation as well. We have some different superstitions and things around death, and all of us come from different backgrounds and different experiences, but trying to understand that truly this is the inevitable. This is what your program is about, is planning for the inevitable. And one thing that none of us can avoid at some point is that passing. So it really is a little bit of counterintuitive, getting a little bit more control by actually having that done ahead of time.
I was actually surprised when we talked to our daughters about that we were going to do some of this planning. And I thought that it would be a bit awkward, but we ended up laughing about some of it. And, it was easier than I thought. And before we actually made some decisions, though, my husband and I spoke to our rabbi to get some thoughts about how things might go if we didn't follow all the traditions, for example. So if somebody dies without having made final arrangements, what happens? What problems might arise?
I think that's a great segue into the conversation that you had with your kids. If you haven't had that conversation both with your spouse, maybe members of clergy, with the family, you don't necessarily know what that person will want. So you're already beginning at this place where there might be different visions of what mom or dad may have wanted in their life. And then there's an uncertainty of maybe, did you do what that person really wanted? Which can be very challenging and can be lifelong, that they live with that consequence of even family disagreements as well. Then again, we talked about the finances. We might have different members of family who have different viewpoints of what might be done and maybe don't all want to spend the same amount. So, and we're making those decisions on the worst day. So we try to say, it's very hard for someone to make the right decisions on the wrong day, right? They're truly trying to do the best that they can. And then for those of us that are aging solo, that maybe don't have anyone that they can ensure is going to help them, they've already done so many things in their life on their own. They've taken care of themselves. They've made so many decisions for themselves. This is another good decision to make ahead of time so that it is truly what they wanted, that their wishes are followed. We rarely have anyone actually never have anyone walk through my door or someone I have a conversation with where plans were arranged and they say, gosh, I really wish my mom or dad had not made these arrangements. I wanted to do all of this. I wanted to make these decisions.
What are the key decisions that someone needs to make when they come to talk with you or somebody else about final arrangements?
Yeah, I think this again is probably, I would say, two broad categories. The first would be what we legally call disposition. So the idea of, do we want to be, generally we'll take two general dispositions, the most common dispositions, cremation or casketed burial. So that's always a good start, like, do we know what we want? And sometimes, again, in couples, it may not even be the same choice, and that is available as well. Again, speaking with a trusted advisor and an expert in the field, you can understand what options there are, but that's really the first start. We're thinking cremation or casketed burial. And then I think the second aspect of that is the service. Are we looking for a celebration of life? Are we looking for a memorial service? Would we like to have that in our local clubhouse, in a chapel, at the cemetery graveside, at a religious facility, or maybe even at your favorite park or beach? There's a lot of different ways. We're all different in life, so we should all be different in our passing and truly have that reflect our wishes. But I do think those are your two main decisions. And I do always encourage loved ones to ensure that they allow their family to have that memorial service, celebration of life, whatever they would like. Doesn't necessarily have to cost a lot of money, but it's part of that grieving process, kind of gives them that opportunity for everyone to come together and speak about that person, honor them, and remember them.
Mm-hmm. And what are the main costs for a burial or for a cremation?
So again, we would kind of divide this into two categories. So you've got your cemetery costs and your mortuary costs. So with casketed burial, of course, one is going to have to choose a physical final resting place. With cremation, someone may or may not choose a physical final resting place. So we would have some costs at the cemetery, assuming we are choosing physical final resting place. And that can be traditionally what many people have thought of as the plot or burial space. It's technically interment rights. If we're choosing in-ground or above-ground burial, there'll be some different costs, but in-ground burial, there's typically in private cemeteries some outer burial containers. There's always a cost to open and close the space. And then there would be a cost for that marker or headstone, something that's going to, talk to us for future generations about our life and the things that we did in our dates of birth and our dates of passing and, our different roles, maybe mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, things like that. So that's generally your cemetery costs. And then the second aspect would be the mortuary, and sometimes we call those funeral costs, but it really is mortuary. And that encompasses picking up our loved one after they pass away, bringing them into our care, preparing them for that disposition. So maybe it's that casketed burial or cremation, as well as the service. So again, maybe it's that memorial service or celebration of life, or maybe the mortuary is not involved.
Are there situations where pre-planning isn't a good idea?
Yeah, so I know that I can speak to with our company, we always say, we plan with the best of intentions, but then life happens. I have a lovely client I'm just working with, and I joke that the favorite child moved to California. They grew up in Florida, and quote unquote, the favorite child moved to California. So they've now moved here, and we're actually changing all of their arrangements that they had made in Florida to arrangements here. So there is some, both via law and then also depending on what company that you choose to use. We, of course, are a nationwide company, so we have this national transferability that we can assist families with and get into those details. So, but essentially, I can say I don't think there's ever a time that it's bad. We can always try to work with a family to see how we can change their plans or move them from one location to another. We still want to plan. We don't want to put off planning as that being that excuse. So we plan with the best of intentions, and then we work with that.
It's a little bit less complicated, I guess, with cremation.
It can be. It certainly can be a little bit less complicated with cremation, but it's all, again, we are so different personally, so kind of making those decisions that are important to you, and then understanding, all the other costs that are involved. I have helped families that do maybe have their burial spot still in New Jersey or Chicago, and then it's a matter of everyone's now flying back to that location. Maybe there's not a lot of family there, so we're staying in a hotel. So just, again, the benefit of having the conversation, understanding, do we want to be laid to rest there, or would it make more sense to be laid to rest nearby?
Yes. My mother-in-law was, her married life and raising the kids was in Chicago. And when she passed, she was in Texas, along with almost all of the family, and my husband and I out in California. So we all ended up flying to Chicago for the funeral. And it probably would have been simpler for the family had she been in Texas, but she wanted to be buried, next to her husband. So that makes sense too. But what you're saying about these things, if things change, if life changes, you can change the plans so they're not fixed in stone. That's really important. Now, my husband and I travel a lot. What happens if you make pre-planning arrangements, but death occurs when you're away from home or visiting somebody, a relative across the country?
Yeah.
What happens then?
Yeah, that definitely does happen. So we actually have a program, it's called our Away from Home Protection. And if someone is more than 75 miles from home, so when we're here in Laguna Woods, we can think even Santa Barbara, San Francisco, New York, or even possibly Europe or another continent. So that would actually repatriate full casketed remains back to the mortuary that you've made arrangements at. And we always like to say we do use the repatriation of full casketed remains because that death probably occurred unexpectedly, and loved ones may want to have a last moment with us. We also will want to verify, certainly from foreign countries, that it is our loved one. Even if we've chosen cremation, we'd want to have that cremation take place here, so we verify that it is our loved one. And it takes care of all of the transportation costs as well as any kind of paperwork that might be required. So that can be very helpful for a family.
I wouldn't normally have thought of the paperwork, but if you're in another country, that could be a major issue. It's sort of like travel insurance for your body.
Yeah, exactly like that, yes.
Yeah. Now, as you alluded to earlier, many of the residents of Laguna Woods Village have no surviving close family members. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, and I think just like those that are trying to alleviate the burden on their loved ones, these folks that are aging solo have, again, done so much for themselves their whole lives. They are in charge. They know best what's meaningful to them. And so pre-planning for them is just as important as pre-planning for anyone else, making sure that their wishes are followed, that they know where they're going to be. That end of lifetime, we don't know what type of peace of mind that gives us by knowing that those arrangements are made. Also very important for them that technically, typically in California, it's your durable power of attorney for health care that's going to be executing these arrangements. So I know that in this series you've had a lot of conversations around that,
Yes.
and whether it be a private fiduciary or a trusted advisor or, like a family I just assisted, second cousin. He was never married, there were no children, both parents had passed away. So there were several second cousins and they were all close with each other, and those second cousins were charged with those wishes, and they knew exactly what their cousin wanted and were honored to be able to carry that out for him.
Yes. Now, of course, here in the village, we also have many residents who come from different national and religious backgrounds. Are funeral planners or directors typically prepared to respond to diverse needs?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that is such an important conversation, not only for those practicing, but oftentimes as we come to the end of our lives, we find ourselves, our traditions, our experience with passing is what we grew up with, and we'll revert to traditions we may not have even been carrying out for the last 10 or 15 or 30 years, but it becomes important to us. And also what's comfortable for us. So definitely kind of, again, giving that opportunity to think about it, but we absolutely have from rabbis, Catholic priests, Buddhist monks. We have several locations that tend to be more typically catered to certain religions. So we have a mortuary that works very closely with a lot of Buddhist families. We have Harbor Lawn Mount Olive that has a very large Jewish section as well as Pacific View. We're very familiar with all traditions, and again, that's about talking with someone who is knowledgeable and trusted and can kind of give some advice and information, because this really is making the decision for ourselves, what's important for us.
Do you have any examples of some unusual practices?
I think typically there's a few things that are traditional, if you will. So thinking about Jewish families of Jewish faith, just that burial, we like to have that happen very quickly, right, within 24 to 48 hours. So that can be a challenge for both family members coming from out of town and family gatherings. Also, we have, Buddhist families that will typically burn incense. So there's some different rules around burning incense, as you can imagine. So we have different barrels for the burning of incense and ensuring we have a peak mortuary where families, the memorial service, if you will, would go over typically 3 days. So their loved one would be at the mortuary, a much smaller chapel, and different family can come over 3 days and do offerings and have their services over that period of time. So definitely trying to honor everybody's different experiences. You know, the other thing we haven't talked about is blended families, right?
Yes.
You know, second marriages or third marriages, you know, situations where whether it was divorce or a spouse predeceased another loved one. So like, you know, that can be a very difficult conversation as well as to where I want to be laid to rest. So that doesn't get easier by not talking about it. The conversation, having those conversations both with our loved ones, our family, as well as with someone in my industry, allows you to kind of think of what would make the most sense, what would be meaningful for me and also for my family.
You mentioned having that conversation with somebody in your industry. If somebody comes to you and has this conversation and has, you know, some ideas about where they want to go, and then they go elsewhere, is that a problem?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, this is what we do. You know, we want to have these conversations. I sometimes say, like, I am very much here to have that first conversation, and then whatever makes sense for the person is the right decision, right? Those are not my decisions. My job is to provide options and information, and family's job is to make decisions. And I do usually say that is the harder part, making the decisions.
Making the decisions. Yes. Do you have any cautionary advice about what people should look out for when making funeral arrangements, whether it's pre-planned or whether somebody dies without making any plans?
Yeah, I think the key there is to, number one, ensure that we are dealing with a reputable organization. Number two is to, as hard as this is to say, to keep our emotions in check, right? It's really thinking about what would have been meaningful for that loved one, but also ensuring that we are making, to some extent, trying to make those best decisions on the wrong day, but without maybe overspending and things like that. You know, unfortunately, when plans haven't been arranged, guilt and other feelings can take over, and then we're making some difficult decisions. So trying to keep that emotion in check. And then on the pre-planning side, that's what gives you the opportunity to really think clearly, take your time. But I guess the end of it, all of that advice is pre-planning is the gift to your loved ones, and it gives you the ability, with hopefully out health or time constraints, to have this difficult conversation. The thing that I have seen over years and years of doing this, the conversation doesn't get any easier. It only gets more difficult. And coming in at the end of life stage when someone is on hospice care or is in the hospital and you're visiting with their family to make these choices and have this conversation, that's not the right time. So although it feels uncomfortable and it might feel very difficult to do this ahead of time, it's not going to get easier, only more difficult.
Do you have any suggestions of how to open up that conversation? I mean, that's obviously a difficult thing for people to initiate.
It is, it is. Well, as they're listening to this series, I hope that they are realizing that all of these decisions, the sooner that they have these conversations, the better. And it's always the first conversation that is difficult. So picking up that phone, just make that phone call and obligate yourself to that first conversation. Doesn't mean you have to spend money, doesn't mean you have to write a check, doesn't mean you have to make decisions right then. But like any big problem, it starts with that first step, or any uncomfortable problem, it starts with that first call. So really having that conversation, whether it be with your spouse, with your children, and then following that on to a trusted advisor to gather information, because we shouldn't make any of these decisions till we have a full knowledge of information, and you truly can't have that till you have that conversation with someone like me.
Yeah. When we spoke before coming to this, you mentioned that the funeral industry is highly regulated. So I've heard stories of funeral directors trying to sell the most fancy caskets or things like that.
Unfortunately, not everybody is of the highest standards. I do feel very comfortable with our company and feeling like anyone within the Dignity Memorial Network would be held to the highest standards. But I can also say that family is very emotional, and if they're making that decision in those difficult times, it can be hard to have too many choices put out in front of them. Even when we're pre-planning, sometimes having too many choices put out can paralyze us, right? So it is this balance of being able to make decisions, but also having those options, you know. So I definitely think, again, to protect oneself, the best way to protect oneself from those kinds of situations is to arm ourselves with information, and best to do that when we have the most amount of time available.
This may sound a bit like a joke, but my husband and I used to kid that he wanted his ashes spread in a park where he bicycles. Are there any limitations to where you can scatter ashes?
There are some definite legal requirements, and you know, people have thought of their favorite park, golf course, Disneyland. None of these are legal options for scattering remains. So, and you don't want to put that burden on your loved one. You know, sometimes they'll make an unrealistic claim, right? And then the loved one is forced with reality of what can I actually legally do, and how do I honor those wishes, and were those wishes the joke, or were those wishes the only thing they know? So going back to having that, you know, we do make light of it, and it is how we deal with difficult conversations, but then it's also not to set an unrealistic requirement or expectation on family.
Yes. I mentioned before we started this that someone I know recently chose to end her own life, and I believe that she's going to, her remains will be scattered at sea, and I know that there's some requirements there too, but I'm sure that they will take place with that. Well, we're near the end, so what is the most important thing that you hope that the audience takes away from our conversation today?
I really hope that they take away that there are a lot of parts involved in final arrangements planning, you know, making those decisions over disposition, casketed burial or cremation, and then service and memorial service, celebration of life, and understanding that this is really personal. We're informed by our life experience, maybe our religious traditions and customs, and no one knows us better than ourselves, and it's always better to sort of have that conversation ahead of time, make those decisions while we're fully capable, we have the ability to take our time and think about what's meaningful to us, and then not leave a burden, but rather leaving a gift to our loved ones or to those that are going to be in charge of these arrangements. I know when I'm finished helping a family, I always give them a very clear, laid out one-page document that tells them this is who to call, this is the first call, these are the arrangements made, and so that they have that peace of mind both for themselves and can provide that to their trusted advisors and their family members. It's really much like having a trust done or putting into place a will. Most of the families I work with, in fact, I'd say every family I've worked with, when they're done making this arrangements, they actually feel much more at peace.
I will say that that was true for my husband and I think for our children. And I wanted to thank you again for coming here today and tell people that this broadcast and others, you'll find links on the foundation website. So, thanks.